WellPod at DC on Riot Radio.
From meditation, stress management, safer substance use, and sexual health, we will literally talk sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Join us to dive deep into some student health questions. We'll learn about wellness together, try some coping tools, and meet some interesting people.
Your co-hosts, Heather and Craig.
Perfect blend of Campus Health and Wellness Center and Sal's.
Each week, we'll DIY a wellness tool together.
And then nerd out and dig into the science behind how it works.
Email your health and wellness related questions to wellpod@durhamcollege.ca to be discussed anonymously on air. Welcome to the WellPod at DC.
Welcome to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. So today we are talking about sweet-tasting, soluble carbohydrates we know as sugar. Ba-da-da-da-da-da. Do you know the end of that? Oh, honey, honey. It's the title of today's episode. Simple sugars include glucose, fructose, and galactose, and compound sugars include sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And I'm sure almost half of those I mispronounce. Sugar comes from plants like agave, beetroot, cane is one of the most popular for refined sugars. Corn, date, maple, as many of us Canadians know, but it's also found naturally in milk, including breast milk. Humans began extracting sugars from plants in South Asia as far back as 8,000 BCE and led to one of the world's most widely used ingredients, refined sugar. Its staying power has come at a cost, however. Global demand powered the transatlantic slave trade, whose ripple effects are still seen and felt today. Sugar was a luxury in Europe up until about the 19th century. Demand for sugar as an essential food ingredient resulted in major economic and social changes. World consumption increased more than 100 times from about 2 pounds per person per year in 1650 to 90 pounds per person per year by the early 20th century. Sugar was rationed during the World Wars, which is said to have led to the development of various artificial sweeteners, and today we see a global average of about 53 pounds of sugar per person each year. Diabetes Canada estimates Canadians eat about 110 grams of sugar per day, so about 26 teaspoons or 21% of total energy intake, and that's sugars from all sources, not just that sweet refined sugar we know in candy. Refined sugar, however, accounts for 21% of the global crop production. The other thing we wanted to highlight is this week's student question. So I ate so much candy for Halloween, I'm starting to feel guilty. I know sugar is bad for us, but I crave it. How can I stop fiending for sugar? So today we're going to explore if sugar is bad, what sugar is and why we crave it, and how we might want to befriend sugar. So, is sugar bad? One of the current challenges that we face is the influence of sugar refineries and manufacturers of sugary foods and drinks in medical research and public health recommendations. So research on the health effects of sugar differ significantly depending on whether or not the researcher has financial ties to the food and drink industry. A 2003 report by the World Health Organization provides evidence that high intake of sugary drinks, especially fruit juices and sodas, increases the risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. Misconceptions, though, around sugar continue. Does it feed cancer? Does it cause hyperactivity in children? Many of these claims have not actually been substantiated in research. The WHO recommends reducing the intake of free sugars to less than 10% of our total energy intake. So about a 2,000 calorie a day diet, that's about 50 grams or 200 calories. Today, we are joined by the Campus Health and Wellness Center's eating disorder psychotherapist, Michelle Pitman. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks. Hi. Thanks, guys, for having me back.
Yeah, it's nice to see you back on the show today. Michelle, sometimes we see sugar really being villainized, or as the student question said, we see it as the bad guy at the food table. Is sugar bad? Should we view foods as good or bad? What are some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, so from an eating disorder therapist perspective, I have some problems with viewing any foods as bad, really. What tends to happen is when we see something bad, right? Like think about the language that we use when we talk about sugar, for example. Oh, I was so bad, or I really can't trust myself around sugar, or I should be eating something other than sugar, right? I need to avoid sugar. And so that kind of language or talk sets us up to have some food rules, right? And when we have food rules, we can think about them in very kind of rigid and unrealistic ways.
And one of the things that you talk about in a neuro-nourishing presentation is sometimes some of the cycles we can get into when we have some of these food rules.
Absolutely.
We have an image here to support. Can you tell us a little bit, even just kind of that starting kind of restriction that you mentioned, what happens when we can start to restrict?
Yeah. So restricted eating is found to be a causal and predominant predictor of binging or overeating, right? So when we think of what restriction is, there's lots of examples. So you can think about restricted eating as skipping a meal. So sometimes, folks that I've supported will skip breakfast. Because they think that kind of sets them up for the day in terms of how their intake will go, right, for the rest of the day. They might have certain rules around how many calories they should be consuming, right? And that's a form of restricted eating because it might be the limit that they set for themselves might be lower than what the body actually needs. Fasting, intermittent fasting, for example, is a very popular,
very trendy
way
right
of
now.
Yes, and it's basically it's fasting and restricted eating. And then with regards to our conversation around sugar, sometimes we restrict certain foods or even entire food groups. And so when we engage in restriction in any of those forms, it sets off kind of alarm bells in the body, right? And kicks off this process of, restrict and binge eating, right? It increases our risk. So when we have those food rules, it can increase our risk of restricting and binging. One of the reasons why is when we avoid those foods, when we avoid sugar or tell ourselves that we can't have sugar, we're we then tend to get preoccupied, right? With, I can't have sugar. Oh, I'm missing sugar. You might walk by a convenience store, maybe into the cafeteria and see a chocolate bar and go, I remember when I used to have that and I can't have that, so it kind of sets off this pattern.
And part of that pattern, I imagine you're kind of hinting at almost this sensation of craving then that can come up.
Yes. Yeah. So again, whether restriction is voluntary or involuntary and what that kind of looks like for you, the body just reads it as restriction, and that restriction that is, there's a risk of famine. That's kind of how the body biologically reads it. And so it sets off this a series of processes physiologically, neurologically, right? Where you might have intense sensations of hunger, and it gets harder and harder to resist the cravings.
And I think we have an image to help support this conversation as well that kind of speaks to that hunger and that craving type cycle that you're speaking of here.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can think of it in terms of like stomach hunger, physiological hunger. So again, the body's reading this as a threat, right? And that homeostasis, our set point, which is another conversation around our weight and what our weight is supposed to be. The body is kind of activated to think, we've got to do something about this deprivation or possible deprivation. So yes, a series of physiological processes kick off, right? Slowing down the metabolism, kind of kicking off like our appetite related hormones from the brain, and then that increased hunger signals, and even in extreme forms breaking down the muscle tissue, right? And then the head hunger piece is, again, the body is reading this potential risk of famine, so it's going to psychologically decrease our motivation to move our bodies, right? And again, it's going to increase our preoccupation with foods, particularly what I call high energy items, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah. And then what can this sometimes segue into? You mentioned the word binging earlier.
Yeah. So we can, oftentimes people, especially when they've had a period of deprivation, they can feel like there's, again, that sense of mistrust around their bodies to be able to regulate their eating. And so binging, as I mentioned, typically involves high energy palatable items. So you might be more drawn to sugary items. Again, physiologically, psychologically, that's what your body is trying to work really hard to protect you. And so whatever the body can get in quickly, to get that energy that it needs, it'll do that. And so that often means that we do overeat because of that restriction, and that's a way of overcompensating for that possible famine. But it may also lead to kind of physiological and psychological discomfort.
Yeah. And now what would be the tail end of this cycle? So we kind of started with some restriction, noticed these hunger cravings, both psychological and in our body, leading to some binging. What's kind of the tail end of this cycle?
Well, it often means emotionally that we're struggling. So oftentimes when I'm working with folks that have this kind of cycle, this restrict binge cycle, they often talk about feeling a sense of a loss of control with their eating, right? And they might feel some guilt and shame and sadness. Yeah. And the interesting thing that kind of keeps this cycle going is having that emotional experience around the overeating or the binge eating episode. Some will interpret it as, that's proof I can't trust myself around food. But in fact, it's not a matter of trust. It's your body is actually doing what it is designed to do. But then, it can kind of set up these thoughts and beliefs of I can't be trusted around these foods. And then it kind of kicks off this cycle of restricting those foods. And then, we kind of continue over and over again.
Is there an activity that we could do to really get us to reflect on some of our thinking around our relationship with food in this whole cycle?
Yeah. So I like to kind of think back to our childhood, right? And I don't know, is this something either of you are comfortable? Maybe?
I'm comfortable with, let's talk childhood.
Yeah? Okay. All right. So Heather, can you think of a food item from when you were younger that was villainized?
Yeah, and it was interesting when you asked me this question the other day in passing in our offices. I was much more able to think of like a good food first, cabbage was really good in my mind, vegetables. But it took me a little bit to think about what item might have been villainized. Sugar, I think, was a little bit up there, but I had a mother who really loved sugar, and so it wasn't too big of a bad guy in our household. But fat, salt, eggs, these were all things that I have memories of noticing that we were restricting ourselves from. The language around it was a little bit more villainized. The bad eggs, bad salt, bad butter, bad fat. A lot around fat.
Okay, let's talk about butter, for example. So, what did you have any times where you would be like allowed or would allow yourself to put butter on something?
It was very luxurious when I could put a really thick slab of butter on like a banana loaf or something like that. It felt very kind of not sneaky, but luxurious when most of the butter in the household had been replaced with margarine. That was a big trend as we got rid of butter. So butter sometimes wasn't even in the house.
Okay, interesting, right? There was this like substitution. You really wanted butter, but there was this sense of, margarine is better for me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So with the butter, what were some of the thoughts that would come up around, when you would have it?
I used the word luxurious and sneaky, but it wasn't necessarily sneaky, but just that it was definitely felt like a treat, something to kind of savor, something that was a little bit kind of special. And it wasn't necessarily a bad feeling, but I don't know another word other than sneaky, right? It was kind of this like, oh, we don't get this very much. Eat all the butter right now.
Yes.
Layered on.
Right? Yeah, like I don't know when I'm going to get this again.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it feels luxurious, and there's something about this that maybe doesn't feel quite right. Like
Yes.
I shouldn't
be
eating this
having
butter.
it.
Yeah. And so what do you imagine the feelings were for you, or maybe anybody else that you were in the household with?
Yeah, I like around butter. As I mentioned, I think it was certainly at the time, margarine was being very much shoved as society as being a better, healthier replacement. And so I don't think my family intentionally tried to villainize butter, but I think it was coming from this place of, well, this is a healthier option. Butter is unhealthy. Butter is more fattening, higher cholesterol, all those big words that when you're little, you don't necessarily know what cholesterol means.
Yeah.
But I think probably the family was feeling similar things of kind of restricting and not feeling like they could have it, that they shouldn't have butter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, oftentimes I work with folks around doing, and this is kind of what I'm setting us up for, a thought record. So, when we talk about thought records, this is a CBT, cognitive behavior therapy intervention.
Yes.
We talk about taking the thought to court.
Oh.
And so just like a lawyer would or a judge would, you're kind of weighing the evidence for and the evidence against. So, what was the evidence? Let's say maybe at that time, what was the evidence to suggest that butter was bad?
Ooh, I think Good Housekeeping magazine certainly had it on the cover sometimes of saying that margarine was better. So I don't think I necessarily had a personal evidence to it, but I do recall kind of seeing in magazines or sometimes commercials where talking about kind of villainizing fat, and fat wasn't very good.
Yeah.
But now that you kind of position it like a court, I don't have clear data points on it actually being unhealthy.
Almost like a cultural aspect to it, right? And there's, when it's something like that, what's the one thing?
Yeah.
There's not. But if we're only buying margarine, because same time frame.
Margarine household,
like, right? We only have margarine, even though
I can't believe it's not butter.
Yeah.
Exactly,
I can believe it's not butter.
But like, there was not, I don't ever recall a discussion, not that I would remember that, but it was just, this is what we use. Maybe because at some point it was mentioned that it was healthier. Yeah. But then that's the case. Or even as much as you say, I can't believe it's not butter, the underlying thing is butter tastes better, but it's not as good for you. So we're going to make something that you can't believe it's not butter, right? Like we're comparing to the good, but somehow maybe villainized thing that we shouldn't have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, to that, so what I'm hearing is like the evidence for was really like the influence. And I mean, this happens to us all the time, right? In popular culture and advertising, right? Like there's a messaging there, right? There's experts, quote unquote, that have some authority around what is good or bad. And that's not to discredit the research. I mean, there might be some valid reasons, but it can oftentimes be taken to the extreme and doesn't allow for nuance, right? Or flexibility. So what would, to that end, what would the evidence be against this idea that butter, in this case, was bad for you?
More evidence that it was bad? I don't know if I have any more.
No, evidence against.
Against, sorry.
Sorry.
The first thing that comes to mind is it tasted really good. It tasted really pleasurable. It felt really good to eat it. Same thing, though, if I think about evidence, in all the really good cookbooks growing up, if you ever flipped through some of your cookbooks, it talked about adding butter. So I remember even reflecting but it's used in all of these recipes, and it's used in other cultural dishes. Why are we stuck with, can't believe it's not butter? So some of the evidence points might have just been kind of how much it was used by other people and chefs and restaurants.
And even, if you will, self-evidence of sometimes you get to a point, not with everything, but something like butter where you're like, but I like butter.
Yeah.
So I'm going to use butter.
Yeah.
Because, there might even be some evidence that it's not as good for me as I can't believe it's not butter. We don't get any sponsorship from them, or it's long gone now.
Yeah.
But just, okay, I'm going to make that choice that, like, I'm going to have butter. I'm going to cook with the butter in this, as opposed to not, just because why not?
And something that has been helping me now that I'm an adult and can make a little bit more of my own informed decisions is hearing, celebrity chefs, for instance, Gordon Ramsay, kind of reiterating that, like, butter is not a villain. Butter is helpful in moderation, and it's good for adding flavor. So some of my evidence right now against the claim is hearing from people that I maybe respect and kind of see similar values that I hold around relationships around food, talking in a positive light around butter.
Yeah. And, from that, discussion of what you both shared, I'm hearing that, the term bad is, it's really hard to kind of quantify, and that there's other aspects of butter that it gives that flavor, right? That richness to your food, that people use it in recipes all the time and they're doing okay. Right? That it actually might add to another element of intuitive eating, which we will probably talk about later, which is satisfaction. So it probably provided you with, when you did have that chance to have the butter and really enjoy it, it provided you with that satisfaction that the margarine didn't necessarily.
Never did. No. Yeah. A lot of satisfaction there.
And so the one other piece that we kind of finish off on with the thought record is, what would be a balanced thought around, in this example, butter?
Probably moderation is a word that's kind of coming to my mind. We maybe don't always want a 2-inch thick slab on everything that we're eating, but a balance of that word satisfaction, making sure that if I'm wanting it, as Craig mentioned, making sure that I'm allowing myself that pleasure, having some balance there with it, using it in moderation, being even just mindful when I am using it, instead of just kind of quickly grabbing a dollop and tossing in the pan, being like, I'm using butter right now. This is enjoyable, and kind of savoring that use and that experience maybe a little bit more. But I've had some conversations with a wonderful Michelle Pitman, so maybe those terms are coming to my mind, rubbed off from some of your talks.
But I think big picture for me, just when you were speaking earlier, is actually thinking about it and having knowledge from somebody, as you said, discussing with Michelle, just from you were mentioning the people skipping a meal and whatnot. And I'm not someone generally who gets up and has breakfast right away, right? But then it can become kind of oversimplifying, because I'm not knowledgeable in the area, but like, okay, I'm doing that on purpose or anything, versus when I reflected, it's actually all my meals, I still have 3 meals a day, they're just shifted. So I tend to eat like lunch, dinner, and then later on at night, and not from a binge eating because I skip breakfast in the morning. Just I'm not that's what my body does.
Your breakfast happens maybe a little bit later in the day.
That's right. That's right. So but the reflection of it, like this activity has done, but overall for eating.
Good.
One of the things that I often think about is how complex food is as a whole, but especially when I became a parent, how much more that kind of stirred up. It really made me reflect, as this activity did, on your childhood and kind of how you felt about food. And so I think for many of our students that are parents, that this can be a really complex relationship. I had mentioned the first time we had seen you on a show, a tool that had helped me wonderfully when I was starting my journey with my son, when he was getting ready to eat solids. And it was an organization called Solid Starts. And we have a screenshot here of their website. And this was started by Mother Jenny Best in 2019. And she said it was born out of necessity. And she was trying to reduce the barriers in feeding babies and starting their relationship with food and their bodies. And I love that on their website, you have access to, they're trying to do every single food in the world, from cactus to crickets to corn to eggs, and introducing how you would introduce it to your family. But specifically for sugar, when I looked on their website, which the Solid Starts team consists of feeding therapists, swallowing specialists, pediatrics and allergists, pediatric dietitians, lactation consultants, and nutritionists. But I love that they say every expert opinion and point of research is filtered through the lens of a parent. But specifically to sugar, which I think for many of us we're faced with on a daily basis, right? We're trying not to villainize, but there's still these questions of, well, how much? How do I talk about this? Do I restrict? Do I not restrict? Especially Halloween and birthdays. So on their website, when asked how much sugar is okay for babies, I love that they stated there's no universal standard. Aim for a gentle balance. Reduce sugar where you can, enjoy food where you can't, and aim to share a variety of food. Try to avoid offering sweets as a reward or withholding as punishment. Remember that children naturally appreciate sweet flavor. All humans are programmed this way. While most toddlers need gentle boundaries to learn that sweets are one of many delicious foods to eat, there's no need to carefully track or restrict them. Michelle, it's not just parents pondering if we should kind of restrict our sugar intake. So whether it's ourselves or with our children, do we restrict? Do we serve dessert first? What happens when our children just keep asking and asking and asking for sugar?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I love this question, and it gets me a little fired up. So as I was mentioning earlier, when we, restrict or limit any foods that increase preoccupation, right, is going to, again, kick off that restrict binge cycle. And so a way around that is, and I'm not saying it's easy, but is to give yourself full permission to have those foods that you've been avoiding. Now, it might take a little bit of planning so that you're not overwhelming yourself if you have been avoiding or, had these rigid rules. But, just starting with, okay, what are some of those items maybe that are a little bit distressing that I do avoid, but I might be able to kind of challenge myself, challenge those food rules.
Yeah.
Right? So, again, in my work, we'll often first of all, kind of identify what we call an exposure hierarchy of those fear foods, right? And as I said, kind of tackle the lower kind of distressing foods first, right? And seeing what happens when, again, I give myself full permission. No rules, no caveats, full permission to eat them when I want. So making sure that you have those foods easily available. And then, just allowing yourself to have as much of it as you want when you want. Now, some people will say, oh, well, again, I can't trust myself. I'm just going to eat it all of the time, right? And I won't be able to stop myself. To a certain extent, that might be true in the beginning, right? Because it is a bit of a novelty to allow yourself full permission. So it does require what I would call like a leap of faith, right? That once I do allow myself that permission, right, and I am eating it whenever I want, that eventually I'll be able to trust myself with those foods. So yes, initially you might kind of find yourself eating more than you would like, and feeling maybe a sense of like, this doesn't, right? And so it's continually kind of coming back to, again, just allowing yourself that permission. And then over time, as your body and your mind start to kind of, again, you start to appreciate and trust, like, oh, okay, I can eat this when I want, that over time, the novelty of that food is going to lose its, right? It's going to diminish. It's not going to feel so special and luxurious anymore, right? And that's called the habituation effect, right? Once again, we're kind of used to it. It just kind of becomes everyday and normal. Then, we do tend to find some balance with it in the end.
One of my favorite quotes that I hear you talk about is the only bad food is the one that spoils in your fridge.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So again, challenging those food rules, right? Is it really bad or good, right? Taking the emotional and moral kind of value that we place on these foods. So So, for example, I use the term high energy item. That's a little bit more of a neutral term, right? So, for example, sugar might be seen as a high energy item because maybe it has some more, of those calories, right? But it's not bad for you in and of itself, right? It's not going to shame you. It's not going to talk badly to you, right? And so, the only food that is bad is that the one that kind of
spoils in your fridge.
Spoils in the fridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have a couple of resources as well that you like to talk about, especially kind of finding balance with eating. Eat what you want and what you need. Can you tell us a little bit about accessible wellness?
Oh, yes. So when I was putting together my portion of the ADHD disordered eating content, I came across this dietitian based in Toronto.
Yeah.
So I love Canadian content. Yay! And so accessible wellness is the Instagram and her webpage, I believe, as well. And her name is Jackie Silver. So she's a dietitian, again, in Toronto. And, she provides support to neurodiverse folks, as well as folks with physical disabilities, in terms of, supporting that relationship with food. And one of the things that she says is, have what you want, add what you need.
Love that. Yeah. Another resource that you've talked about is Ellen Sater, especially around her division of responsibility. And we have a screenshot of her website where she has all sorts of books and concepts and theories. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea of division of responsibility?
Yes. So when I started my intuitive eating journey, several years ago, and I had a young family, I came across a book of hers called Secrets of Feeding a Healthy Family. And it was really helpful for me, not only my own intuitive eating journey, but in supporting my family, right? And finding joy in food again, and it not being so stressful
and restricted and rule based.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the one concept that really stood out to me was this division of responsibility. So she talks about how parents can provide the structure, like the what and the when of eating for the family, and that the children are responsible for the whether and how much of eating. So providing everybody with some choice.
Love that. After this break, we're going to continue to explore what is sugar and why we crave it. Back here on riotradio.ca. welcome back to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. So if you look at the scientific definition of addiction, sugar doesn't fit perfectly. Bold clickbait headlines claiming sugar is more addictive than cocaine or sugar is the same as heroin in our brain might be nothing more than some misinterpretations of a few rat experiments. Does sugar have opiate-like properties? Is sugar addictive? We're still a long way from fully understanding why we crave sugar so much. There's an infamous study at Preston where researchers starved rats and then gave them food supplemented with sugar solution. Within a month, they doubled their sugar intake and preferred it accordingly to cocaine. But when the sugar was removed, the rats got apparently symptoms of opiate withdrawal. But many research points at flaws of these studies. Withdrawal symptoms or nervous symptoms and other behavioral rat symptoms from being starved and then given sugar. Many animals will naturally seek sugary things over cocaine. And while there's no current consensus if sugar should be viewed as an addiction, there is a general consensus that sugar consumption alters our brain reward system and the circuits that control eating behavior. Nicole Anna Blanchard, a PhD assistant professor in pharmacology sciences at the School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, states that their studies show there are neurochemical changes in the brain that occur when we overeat sugar that are similar to what we see in addictions to drugs like alcohol or morphine. So some science is exploring sugar cravings, and we're looking at imbalances in blood glucose levels. Low blood levels might cause you to crave something sweet in order to bring up those energy levels. Other factors that could play a role include psychological stress, medications, hormonal imbalances like serotonin and insulin, which we'll talk about in a few. Michelle, thoughts on why we might crave sugar so much?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it comes back to what I was talking about in the previous segment, which is if we're restricting, right, our body is going to fight really hard, and so it increases the hunger signals, and particularly gravitates towards those high energy items, which might include sugar, because the body's just looking to get that nourishment in as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. Craig, what is sugar to our body? Like how does our body use sugar, and what is it?
Yeah, so for sugars, it's all about energy, right? So our cells are 40 trillion approximately as
Did you
grown
count them
adults.
all?
I counted them all out just before the show came on. But all of them require energy, and just the scientific term or chemical there is ATP, right? And all of our cells, to make that ATP, which then goes into allowing the various physiological responses, things like moving our muscles and so on, we require that form of energy. And so our bodies are made to make that ATP, and we can make it from several chemicals, but the number one is what we're talking about here today, right? Number one, our body uses glucose to make that ATP along with oxygen and things like that. And so this is our number one focus. Like, why do we seek out sugar and whatnot? Is our bodies are using it constantly, and we can still use other things like fats and protein, but our body uses those like secondary to glucose. And some of the things you were saying earlier from an evolutionary standpoint is right up my alley, in the sense of, this is what our bodies are built around. Long before we could walk down the hall and get a Coke out of the machine and it's got 69 grams of carbs within it, or whatever crazy number it is, we had to go find it.
Yeah.
Right? And we had to seek it out. Like, sometimes it's even interesting to think, like, is sugar sweet as an inherent taste about sugar, or it's what's going on in our minds to make sure that we keep going and getting it? Is like, this is tasty, good, must get more.
Yeah.
Or must get more at least at some point, right? In the sense of, as you were mentioning, sugars go low, okay, signal from brain, go seek out where you found that apple the last time.
More energy. We need more energy.
Exactly, right? And so that's, that it overlaps a lot with what you're saying, where we might be looking at it from our current time of, that's bad or whatnot, but it's our body's natural, for whatever reasons going on, but my sugars are going low or whatever the case is. I need to, seek out some sugar. Again, but then it's a little bit more ubiquitous, I think is the word, right? You can find it everywhere and so on, but it's still something that everything that you had shared before, right, is related to overall how our bodies function to keep us alive, because we need it in the end to make that energy.
Today is World Diabetes Day, and diabetes is a serious condition that can occur when the pancreas is no longer able to make insulin, or when the body cannot make good use of the insulin it produces. This affects how our body turns food into energy. Too much sugar in our diet may disrupt the hormone insulin, and insulin helps to regulate the amount of sugar in our body and our blood. Eating too much sugar may lead to insulin spikes or sugar imbalances, and our body may need to make more insulin to keep up with the increase in sugar that's coming in. This can increase our risk of something called insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, or type 2 diabetes. Craig, could you share some insights? You live with diabetes. What has this journey been like for you?
Yeah, that's hard to summarize, of course, in a small little
1 minute.
1 minute go. But I think something to point out is something I was going to say about sugars earlier as well. Sorry to kind of go back to that, but it's some of the confusion about terminology and whatnot, right? I don't know. I'm sure you've spoken to people before. Sometimes my kids ask me things as they learn from family, from school, that sugar's bad. Vastly overgeneralized. Even what sugar is, in the sense of, you were mentioning earlier on, there's refined sugar, but then there's sugars in almost everything we eat, and how our body processes that is very different. You said something, I think, earlier of spoonfuls of sugar or something, right? But it's like there might be that much sugar in a granola bar, but that's very different in terms of how our body processes that relative to, I literally get a spoonful of sugar. And so all that to say, in terms of diabetes, there's several types. So type 1 and type 2 that you were mentioning. The pre-diabetes as well is typically someone who might be being looked after, like, okay, we haven't diagnosed you quite yet as type 2, but your sugars are high, and let's see if we can manage it through diet, exercise, and so on. There's gestational diabetes as well. So when a mother develops diabetes during pregnancy, and from what I've read, often then after the baby is born, then it goes away. Though I think then there's higher incidence of developing type 2 later on in life, and so on. And so I'm actually a type 1 diabetic, as you know, and so that is insulin dependent diabetes. So basically the gist of it, my pancreas sucks, and it doesn't make enough of what I need, and so I have to provide insulin to myself in order to be able to process the sugar. So what ends up happening as we after we digest and absorb that into our blood, it gets absorbed into our muscles, into our liver, and insulin is, if you will, the wingman that goes along with the sugar and says, hey, cells, take this in so that we can store it or use it for, like we said before, making the ATP and so on.
I heard it called a locksmith in the past, right? It kind of unlocks the cell to allow the sugars in.
Exactly, right? And so the type 1, I don't make enough of that, whereas type 2, the individual is, and I mean, there's a sliding scale maybe here, but the person's making that insulin, but the locksmith is not very good at actually getting the cells to take that sugar in. So then that would be when someone's taking a pill, typically metformin is the name of the medication, that then is the locksmith of the locksmith, tells the cell that it should respond to the locksmith to let the sugar in.
And do you recall, how old were you when you first got diagnosed?
So I was
roughly
38.
38?
Yeah.
And your relationship with sugar, did it change after you got that diagnosis?
For sure it did, just in the sense of having to track it, a whole lot more in terms of type 1 especially. I have on my phone the app that connects to my sensor that's on my arm and gives me, constant updates of what's going on and so on. But I think key is, like, I've learned a lot about what goes on with sugars when it's like behind the curtain, if you will. I'm hungry, so I ate. Well, was it that something was going on with your sugars? Was it a feeling or something going on emotionally or otherwise?
Stress, I've read a little bit, yeah.
Right? And so just as an example is, I remember a couple of years ago, and I mean, this happens other times as well, but my sugars, I was checking them constantly high for about like a week or so, and it was like, yeah, but then I gave myself my correction insulin that should be bringing it down, and and it's still high, and it's still high. And it was right around the time where we had put in an offer on a house. And then we were accepted as the people to purchase the house. So then we had to go about getting all the mortgage stuff together and so on. And so basically we, purchased the house, signed the papers, had a mortgage in place, and then my sugars on my chart went, and then they were right back within the normal range, right? Which is stuff prior to, or if I had never become diabetic, I would never know that was going on in my body. But because I get those constant updates, then you're a little bit more aware of that kind of thing.
Thanks for sharing
Yeah,
a little bit of your journey. After we get back from this quick break, we're going to talk about how we can befriend sugar. Back here on riotradio.ca. Welcome back to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. Michelle, thoughts on why, and not why, but how we can befriend sugar a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with challenging those food rules that we set for ourselves. So kind of developing some awareness around, oh, is that a food rule creeping in? Right? And then challenging it, much like we did with the thought record we did earlier, and with that full permission, right? And so a couple of not resources, but approaches would be practicing intuitive eating or mindful eating. So being mindful with your eating. I think earlier we were talking about that savoring part, right?
Yeah.
So really kind of slowing down and noticing how our body kind of takes that in. Like, what does it kind of taste like, smell like, feel like, right? And it might find like it might be an interesting experiment, especially trying some of those foods that you might be demonizing, right? Of maybe when I do allow myself to slow down and really take it in, maybe it's not as alluring as I originally thought, right? So yeah, intuitive eating really, I mean, I could talk about intuitive eating in one podcast alone and maybe not even totally cover it, but there's like 10 principles, and basically those principles, if I were to sum them up, it's 1, getting rid of a diet culture, or like to stop dieting or reject the diet culture. And the other is not only accounting for hunger and fullness, but also that satisfaction piece that we talked about. Like all of those things together are really important for kind of our eating competency, and to also feel less distress and more joy in our eating.
I've been trying to practice some of your principles and some of your wisdom from the first time we had you on the show, and my little one now is saying things like, my body is saying it's feeling full. And so I'm loving hearing some of that language creep out. One thing though that you and I have talked about is with intuitive eating, as wonderful as the principles are, there can be a little bit of privilege that sometimes surrounds this world.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and that's often been the criticism of intuitive eating, you know, that to be able to eat what you want, when you want, how much you want, it requires a certain amount of financial privilege, social privilege, appearance privilege, i.e. thin privilege, right? So if you were to see a higher weight person, you know, eating an ice cream, you might make some assumptions about that, but maybe they're just enjoying the intuitive eating experience.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about language as well? I've heard kind of language talked a lot today. Can you tell us a little bit how that might be a way that we can befriend sugar and other foods?
Yeah. So coming back to this concept of you know, I think this has been a theme today of the challenging the food rules, right? And so, yeah, how can I reframe that language in a way that's more kind of neutral and less judgmental?
You've talked about like fat phobia in the past as well.
Yes.
Even just that word fat.
Yes. Yeah. So diet culture really has a lot of that kind of bad moral kind of language, right? And so we need to dismantle that. We need to kind of break free from diet culture. And diet culture is intimately connected with fat phobia, right? So oftentimes the underlying message with some of those food rules of I can't eat that or I shouldn't eat that is, if I do, I'll get fat, and fat is a bad thing, right? And so it not only requires us to dismantle diet culture, but also to dismantle fat phobia as well.
I hear a lot of social justice in that, and kind of this almost kind of activism mindset behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, what that might look like is, first of all, doing some of your own personal reflection, right? And challenging your own internalized fat phobia, fat bias. And on a more kind of structural level, that is advocating for change, right? So for example, in Canada, in Ontario, in anywhere in Canada, we don't have any protections for people based on body size and weight. So demanding that of your elected officials, right? Let's get this added into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms or the Human Rights Codes, and start to kind of treat fat people with the dignity and respect that we all deserve.
There's a really good book that I remember you discussing, and I think we have a screenshot of the book cover and the author, Sabrina Strings, the book Fearing the Black Body. Yeah, so it talks about that connection between kind of racism, capitalism, sexism, patriarchy, and how that the history behind that, and how that is also tied to the way that we view bodies, and particularly fat bodies. So a really, really interesting read for sure. And not just reads, but some good listens as well. Another podcast outside of this favorite preferred WellPod at DC. Is there a podcast that you would recommend, especially kind of around sugar? Well, the one that comes to mind is Maintenance Phase. Aubrey Gordon, and I believe she has a co-host, I'm just forgetting his name, I'm sorry, is the episode is The Trouble with Sugar, and it looks at some of that research that you were talking about, kind of that, and challenging this idea that, yeah, sugar is like cocaine and so on and so forth. So definitely worth the listen, and add some humor to it as well, which I like. I tossed it on for a few minutes and I was chuckling all through it. And another good podcast podcast that you had mentioned was the Food Psych podcast by Christy Harrison.
Yes. So Christy Harrison is a dietitian in the States and also has written a couple of books about dismantling diet culture and fat phobia. And so she has a number of guests on, and they kind of explore, quote unquote, wellness and what that might mean from like a more holistic lens and less of a diet culture lens.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Michelle. And for those of you that would like to continue this conversation, but maybe in a one-to-one setting, don't forget you can book one-to-one appointments with Michelle Pitman, whether you're a DC student or an Ontario Tech student, and you can visit the Campus Health and Wellness Center to learn more, or at durhamcollege.ca/distress around food. So this is our end of our episode today. Some of the books, tools, and resources that were mentioned will be on our podcast, or not a podcast, our Instagram at wellness@DC. Don't forget you can email your questions to be discussed anonymously on air at wellpod@durhamcollege.ca. Next week, our next episode, we're going to have some community partners on to talk about the importance of learning about AIDS and HIV. And you can also follow the Media Hub at DCSA Media Hub. Is it .ca? My notes kind of skipped ahead. Would it be .ca?
Yeah,
I'm looking to the boys ahead there. But anyways, thanks for listening to the WellPod at DC, and we'll see you next time on riotradio.ca.